Hello guys, welcome to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. Welcome back if you're an OG. I'm here today by myself. Whoop whoop, we've got a break from Georgia Mott, thank God. Not really guys, if you're an OG listener, you know G has been on the pod for the last 4 weeks. We did heaps of episodes together. In the last 2 weeks let's go back. In the last 4 weeks, so 4 weeks ago we did the rapid fire nutrition podcast. So we did 30 questions in 30 minutes, which was really cool because I think there was so much value. It was a funny app because G and I just go off, but I think there was a lot of value and education in that app, and heaps of people reached out and they were just like, that was brilliant. And then the week after we did training as well. So 30 training questions in 30 minutes, really cool. So if you haven't listened to those, go back and have a listen because there's just heaps of juice. Obviously, if you think 30 nutrition questions, lots of value in there. And then in the last 2 weeks, we did the wrap up of my muscle gain phase, which finished at the end of June. And then the week after that, just last week, we did setting up my fat loss phase. So obviously now I am heading into my fat loss phase, or I'm in my fat loss phase when this episode comes out, which is cool. It's exciting. See how I feel in a few weeks, but I'm very excited. So we did all 4 of those episodes in the last month. G was the co-host on all of them. Obviously, we know she's funny. She's got a lot to say, sassy G, but I'm back today solo epping, and I am doing an episode today about tracking progress. And I feel like that might sound a little bit dull, but I've got a lot to say. And a few months ago, actually, to be a while, maybe nearly a year, in the back half of last year, we did an episode about scale weight, which I think is obviously like a big topic when we think about dieting and fat loss, nutrition training, all the things. And there's a lot that can come up with the scale weight convo in terms of mindset and mentality, but then also just I like to obviously educate and help people understand things a little bit more. So that episode was in the back end of last year. It's literally called Scale Weight. So if you haven't listened to that one and you think that would be of interest to you, you can go back and do so. Today I want to talk about tracking progress as a whole. And there's definitely going to be some of that scale weight chat that comes in here because obviously that can be a big part of tracking progress. But I think a bit more of a more broad convo today. And obviously if we think about that one happening, or that episode, happening nearly a year ago, obviously things changed just in terms of, tracking progress hasn't changed, but the way we explain things, and I think the way I personally explain things obviously changes over time because I'm continuously coaching people and educating and teaching and learning. And I think the more you go through those things, the more you just kind of pick up little things where you're like, oh, that would be a good way of explaining it, or that would be a good thing to talk about just through experience. So even if you're someone who thinks like, oh, I know how to track progress, or I've heard Ruby talk about this before or whatever, I still think there'll be some new stuff today. And like I've said before, I think it's cool to realize that we're going to take in different things differently at different times. So even if we think about that scale weight episode, if you were in a position when that episode came out where you weren't dealing well with the scale, or you weren't dealing well with tracking progress or anything like that, you just might not have wanted to receive it. Like, you might have seen the name and just been like, nope, I'm not listening to that. Or you might have listened to it but been really like defenses up, fuck off Ruby, I don't want to hear it kind of energy. And that's totally fine. I'm not shaming that at all. I think we're all going to take in different things at different times, and we're going to be open to hearing and receiving different things at different times. And I think it's just cool to then revisit things a little bit later on, and you might be like, okay, I'm ready to hear this now. And if that's you, just know that that is like literally part of being a human being, and it's a big part of the nutrition and training journey. So just always meet yourself where you're at. And if you're ready to hear it today, perfect timing because I'm ready to talk about it. So when it comes to tracking progress, like I said, obviously the scale weight is a big part of that. But then also I'm going to talk about a few different things today with pics and measurements and other things. And one of the first things I want to speak to here, I said this in the scale weight episode, and I've said this in so many ways in the past on the podcast and in other places. Obviously, if you're someone who has had a lot of history with nutrition and training and dieting and progress and weight and maybe a bit of a negative mindset with any of these things, it's super common to maybe have a bit of beef with the scales and you don't love taking weight and you've got some shit going on there. And like I've said before, there can be a lot of conditioning there. If we think about being a female, I know most of my listeners are female, obviously everyone in Eat Like Ruby female. If you think about being a female who has spent years dieting or watching their weight, watching their body, trying to change things, anything like that, it was super common for a long time to just be in that mentality of like, if weight goes down, it's good. If it goes up, it's bad. And to just even be in the mentality of like always dieting and always pursuing weight loss. If we think about someone being conditioned to thinking if weight goes down, it's good, that can then form a connection with someone just literally being on a quote weight loss diet forever. And it's funny when you think about this is already off topic from the tracking progress stuff, but if you think about a person who doesn't really need to lose weight, yet they're sort of in this mentality of like, oh, I should always be watching what I eat, with a underlying like almost subconscious thing of like, I shouldn't eat bad and I should always be kind of trying to lose weight. It doesn't even make a lot of sense because you don't need to. But for so many of us, that's just the conditioning. And sort of if we think back to years of maybe seeing older females in your life do that, or just seeing, back in the day, magazines and shit like that. And then obviously moving into the social media era where you now see it on Instagram and YouTube and everywhere. It makes a lot of sense that you've kind of just formed that mentality of you should always be pushing for that thing. But I think it's cool to acknowledge that conditioning, and we never want to shame ourselves for that. Like if that's all we've ever known, or that's kind of the cycle we've been stuck in, or anything like that, I never want to shame that. I never want people to kind of beat themselves up about that. But there is one thing I want to speak to today, and we've kind of spoken to this in different ways on the podcast before. I speak about this a little bit to the girls in Eat Like Ruby, but I think it's a cool thing to clock here. If we think about scale weight, dieting, eating for weight loss, trying to be good, anything like that, and really kind of honing in on the scale, often people can then be like, that's been my story for years. That's been my narrative for years. That's all I've ever known. And then they might come into Eat Like Ruby, or they listen to the podcast, they join another program, anything like that. And you start to kind of get taught differently, right? Because obviously we speak about this stuff all the time and we're trying to change that narrative. The one thing I want to speak to here is, yes, it can be true that there's conditioning and there's stories and there's all these things, and we've done it one way for a long time. And while it can be true that we can't just flick a switch and like change that overnight, or be like, oh, well, Ruby told me not to worry about the scale, so I'm not going to worry anymore. The other part to that people need to look at is, at what point do we say, okay, yes, this was my conditioning, this was my story, this is the way it was for me for a long time, and I am going to actively intercept that and start to change it. Because people can dabble in that like, well, this is just the way it's always been for me, and I've got so much history with this, and I've got so much mindset work to do with this. And while that can absolutely be true, and like I said, I'm not shaming it, it can also be a very convenient reason to stay in it. If you know that all of that is true for you, you have to really catch yourself in the secondary gain that comes in there. And if we don't know what secondary gain is, I've spoken about this before, but it's basically like, on the surface, this thing that we kind of talk about as a quote problem actually has a very big convenient payoff as well. So if on the surface we're kind of like, poor me, I've been conditioned to feel this way and I always feel this way and I've got so much history and this is just my stories and this is just the way it plays out for me. How convenient, because I don't have to change it. How convenient, because I still get to whinge about the scale. But the underlying thing is, for as long as I shame myself, I get stuck. And for as long as I'm stuck, I get to keep repeating the same thing that's keeping me comfortable. And there's a lot to think about there, because people would be like, well, no, it's not comfortable. I want to change this. But if we think about everything I just said, if we've been dabbling in this, poor me and I can't move away from my mindset with the scale and whatever, we get to keep fixating on it. We get to keep whinging about it. We get to keep being like, oh, but Rubes, it went up 200 grams and all of these things. If on the surface, again, we're like, I want to change this thing, but the underlying thing is I kind of like, poor me, I'm stuck here, whatever. For as long as I'm stuck, I'm comfortable because I'm used to being stuck in this thing. And I mean, we can apply this to everywhere in life. So the really important thing to think about here is we know that there's conditioning and there's history and there's all the things I just spoke about. If you actually want to change that, you have to acknowledge, is there actually a little bit of secondary gain? Is it a little bit convenient and comfortable for me to continuously dabble in this thing and keep looking at this thing, keep fixating on this thing and keep running the same story? If what I'm getting at here is, if we're not getting it, if we think about doing that versus the alternative being like, okay, it's time for me to intercept this, actually learn and really take on board what is happening with the scale, what is an intelligent way to assess progress, what is all of the things that Ruby's been talking to me about for years. We really want to start actually taking it all on board and rewriting the story. If you've got the history, the conditioning, the stories, that's totally normal. Like I said, don't shame yourself, but also intercept it and be like, do I want to keep carrying these stories or is it time for me to change them? And again, that can be applied to anything in your life. And a little thing I want to point out here, guys, I feel like I might have mentioned this the other week with G, and I've mentioned this to the April fat loss phase girls a few times, but I think this is so important for people to think about is, where are you only hearing what you want to hear? And where are you only seeing what you want to see? And the reason I'm bringing this up again now is because when we think about scale weight and tracking progress and all of that, I can spend so much time doing podcasts, doing live calls in the fat loss phase, writing modules, giving so much info about how to assess progress, what to do, what not to do, how to do it intelligently, etc. And people can have access to all that information, pick one little thing that's like, oh, I know you said that if my weight doesn't move, I should change my calories. How convenient that you picked that one little thing out of every single thing that we mentioned and spoke about when it comes to tracking progress. We've mentioned the most intelligent ways to do this and all of the things we want to look at before making a decision, like adjusting calories or declaring something isn't working. But we, often conveniently leave a lot of those things out and be like, oh, well, Rube said if my weight doesn't move, I should change my calories. Ruby said a lot of other things as well, and you've left those out. So it's super important, again, to catch that and think, where am I only hearing what I want to hear? Where am I clinging to little one-liners or little bits of information or advice from Ruby without actually putting it into context and taking everything on board and making these intelligent, informed decisions? So that's just a little bit of the mindset stuff that I want people to think about before we talk about tracking progress, because I think, again, it almost goes full circle and ties in. I'm going to sit here and say all this stuff about the tangibles and the info and the advice, and people would then come at me and be like, oh, you said that one thing. It's like, no, I said 40 minutes worth of things. Listen to it all and take it all on board, not just the one thing that you wanted to hear. So important to think about that. And the other kind of mindset thing that I wanted to bring up here, but it starts to go into the tangible stuff too, is we need to be a little bit more open-minded about what progress actually means. Because for so many people, and if you've spent most of your life trying to lose weight or actually losing weight and just being in that mentality, it makes sense that you associate progress with weight loss. That absolutely makes sense. But I think it's just cool, like always, I want to bring more awareness and just have people have that open-mindedness to think progress can mean so many different things. And even if I think right now we've got the girls in Eat Like Ruby pursuing muscle gain, progress to them is literally scale going up at times. So that's just even really cool to think about. And if that doesn't apply to you because you do have a weight loss goal, that's totally fine. But just open your mind a little bit and remember that, quote, progress can mean so many different things, and progressing towards goals can look like so many different things, and it can look like different things for you at different times. And I think there's even girls in Eat Like Ruby who can relate to that, where you might have pursued muscle gain and fat loss and physical results like that. But progress can also mean improving training performance, improving strength, improving relationship with food, being more flexible with food, moving away from tracking, having more food freedom, eating out more. Progress can literally mean eating out more, and it can mean eating out less if we think about it. And that purely comes down to the individual and their goals at the time. And that just ties in with what I always say about there not being right or wrong. It's not right to eat out more. It's not right to eat out less. What is the most optimal, the most beneficial for you, depending on your goal, is going to look really different depending on what that goal is. So really clock that, guys, and just have a think about what you've associated. Most people will have quite a subconscious sort of link in their mind with when they think of the word progress. Does that mean scale goes down, weight loss, fat loss, dropping a size, whatever? Because progress can actually mean so many different things. And I think on that note, the last little thing I'll say, especially if you are someone who has either doesn't have a fat loss goal or has ticked off your fat loss goal, really important to have a little think to yourself and get clear on like, what is progress to me now? Especially if we think about everything I said before, where maybe you spent your whole life working towards weight loss or fat loss, and that was just what was deemed to be like good for you for a long time. If you've actually ticked that off, it's really important to bring awareness to that and think, that's no longer progress to me. That's no longer the goal. That's no longer what I'm working towards. So what am I now going to deem as progress and something I want to move towards or anything like that? And again, it can be so different. It purely comes down to the individual thinking, what do I actually want to work towards? What is something I want to strive for, achieve, tick off, whatever? And then really starting to think, okay, I need to change my mentality and my subconscious thoughts of what I am associating with progress, because that's actually changed for me now. And that's really cool. So wherever you're at with that, just have a little think about what it actually means for you right now. And then also being open-minded to thinking, okay, just because progress looks like XYZ for me, it can actually look very different for someone else, and that's perfect. And on that note, guys, obviously for a lot of people, we do think about body composition goals when we think about progress. And I just want to give people permission to actually do that. And the reason I say this is because obviously we can come on here and rant and rave about not always striving for body composition goals, but then we can also really talk about body composition goals at times. And then I think it's common to go on the internet and see a lot of chat about, don't spend your whole life pursuing weight loss, and you don't have to have a body composition goal, and you don't have to count calories, and you don't have to do all these things. It's almost like that life's too short energy, like beautiful at every size. And while that shit can absolutely be true, I'm not saying that's not true. It can also be true and fine if someone's like, okay, but I do have a weight loss goal. I do have a fat loss goal. I do want to change my physique. I do think I would feel better if I lost weight, joined the gym, ate better, whatever it is. Full permission to actually have phases and times in your life where that is your goal and that is your focus and that is what you're deeming progress. So almost the opposite of what I just said, but like I always say, duality. Let it be okay that for some people progress is moving away from tracking their food and focusing on their gym strength. And for other people, progress very much might be fat loss right now, and that's perfect too. So really meet yourself where you're at with that. And if you're someone who's felt a little bit of shame over time because the internet is telling everyone that you shouldn't have a weight loss goal, you shouldn't have a fat loss goal, there absolutely can be times in your life when you do. And full permission for me to get after it with that. And I mean, side note, but I get that all the time because I'm obviously pursuing fat loss, and people say to me every single day, like, you don't need to be. Can it be okay that I've got a goal, I want to be, I've actually got great health and systems in place and everything to do so, and that's just what I'm deeming progress for literally like a 2 or 3 month period. And that's a perfect example of what I was just saying. What is progress to me has looked so different at different times this year and last year, and that's perfect because it's purely depending on my goal at the time. Now, one thing I want to say here, guys, I've said this before, but I will say this over and over again because I think this is something that ties in with my first comment or my first 2 comments, where people are not wanting to hear me say this, especially, but it is something we really need to think about. If you do have a physical goal in terms of fat loss or weight loss and a body composition goal, this is not a bad thing, like I said, but it's super important to take it the step further and think about what it truly is you want to achieve and what you want to change or what you want to be different in your life as a result of that goal. And what I mean by that is it's super common for people to just say things like, I want to lose 5 kilos. I want to lose 10 kilos. I want to get under 80. I want to get under 70, whatever it might be. That can be perfect and you can absolutely work towards that. But you need to be clear on what it actually is that you want to achieve as a result of that thing. Because we know that scale weight can fluctuate and there'll be ups and downs with numbers and things like that. And there can be the mindset struggles and the challenges and everything that comes along there. We need to actually be clear on what it is we're working towards and why. And if we think about a person who is, saying, I want to lose X amount of weight or I want to hit a certain number, the underlying thing there for that person is I want to look a different way or I want to feel a different way. I want to feel a different way because of the way I look. I want better health. I want better confidence. Any or all of these things, that is the real goal. And it's so insanely important to understand that, because just focusing on the numbers is where people go crazy. They do their heads in, they're never satisfied. They obsess over little things, the fluctuations, all of the shit we've spoken about before. If the actual goal is to look a certain way and or feel a certain way and have that then cause a flow-on effect in your life with health or performance or being able to do things that you can't currently do or you've never done before, and feeling more confident, feeling more healthy, wearing different outfits, doing different activities that you didn't feel confident to do before, anything like that, that's the real achievement, that's the real goal, and that's the thing that we can think about and we can keep in mind when we do have fluctuations or we do have, quote, bad days or anything like that. We need to actually know, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What am I working towards? How do I think my life will be different when I reach that thing? Why do I want my life to be different? What is the improvement, etc.? So we've actually got the clarity around that, not just I want to drop 5 kilos. Because it's not enough. It's actually not. Mentally, that's not enough. And I'm not going to get too much into the fluctuation, scale fluctuation chat today, because we did that on the scale weight episode. So definitely go back and listen to that one if you haven't. But what I want to talk about with that is the fact that there will be fluctuations. There will be ups and downs. And the thing I think people need to think about here, in super short, we know that there can be scale weight fluctuations from things that have absolutely nothing to do with body composition or body fat levels. We know this as a scientific fact. And again, if you don't understand that, go back and listen to that other episode. But the reason I like to point that out is because we need to have, I've said this before and I'll say it a million times, we need to have multiple forms of assessment in place, and we need to assess multiple methods over time, not overnight. And I will preach that forever, because if we think about scale fluctuations when a person has a body composition goal and they're working towards fat loss or weight loss or whatever, if those fluctuations are coming in and happening as we know they do, if we don't have any other form of assessment in place like measurement or pics or anything like that, people can get really fixated on those fluctuations, and they have nothing to do with progress towards the thing that you want to progress towards. They literally are just part of you being a human being. So you actually need to have something in place alongside that to piece it all together and actually assess if you're moving in the direction that you want to go. And even if we think about what I just said before, having progress pictures for this reason is so beneficial, because if you think about the fact that your actual goal is to look a certain way, feel a certain way, etc., the pictures are actually going to confirm this way more than the scale does. The goal is not to weigh a certain number. The goal is to look or feel a certain way. Pictures or videos, I guess, in this day and age, progress videos, are going to show that way more than the number on the scale will. So I think, in my opinion, pics and or videos are the absolute way to go. But if we think about having multiple methods, like I said, if the scale fluctuates, you can actually look at measurements and pics alongside that and piece everything together. If you have a bad day with the pics, you can look at measurements, scale, whatever. It's not just, if we've just got that one thing that we're using to assess, we know that things are going to have ebbs and flows, peaks and troughs, fluctuations, all of that. If we're only watching that one thing, we've got nothing else tangible to look at on the day that those fluctuations or those ebbs and flows kick in. And to me, that's just not intelligent. This is where we do see people get very emotionally driven and they spiral and they're like, it's not fucking working. I need to change everything. Where if we had something else to turn to at that time, we could actually keep it within the facts and the logic and continue to make informed decisions, not emotional decisions. And that's, a whole nother combo. But we don't want to be in that energy where we are just watching one thing, we see a random spike or we see a random bad day, and then the emotion kicks in of like, fuck, it's not working, I need to change everything, etc. When really it's not the fact that we need to change anything, it's that we need to make a more intelligent assessment before we start thinking about changing things. And on that note, one little thing I want to talk about is rate of progress with the scale, because I think this is such an interesting convo and I could probably take this in so many directions. But I'm going to talk about myself for a little second as a bit of an example. Whenever I go into a fat loss phase, and most of you guys will know I usually do an intentional high calorie muscle gain, weight gain phase, then flip it and go into a fat loss phase. I'm literally in the process of doing this right now, just a few weeks in. For myself personally, it usually takes about 4 weeks to see any movement on the scale. And full disclosure, guys, I'm recording this on the 19th of June and then it's going to come out early July and I will be in my fat loss phase. And you might have seen, I might have done progress report or update, scale weight, anything like that on Instagram. It may move, it may not in that first week. I could be sitting here right now standing like a bit of a liar because you could be like, well, I just watched you lose weight in 1 week. So I have no idea how that first week is going to respond. But for me personally, I've got a lot of history. I've got a lot of data and I've collected a lot of evidence over the last few years of doing muscle gain and fat loss phases. It is such a common theme for me to go from high cal muscle gain phase, big calorie drop into a fat loss phase and absolutely nail it. Adherence is on point, consistency is on point, and nothing moves for 3 to 4 weeks. That is such a common occurrence for me. And the reason I'm saying this is because I feel like so many people may have experienced this or can relate, and people experience this for 8 days and think that they're so hard done by, but it's usually 3 to 4 weeks for me. And I just want to point out, this can be so normal, this can be so common. And if we think about, I've said before way back on the pod, if you're an OG listener, you'll know this, but a kilo of body fat is 7,700 calories. So if we put on a kilo of body fat, it's because we've given the body an excess of 7,700 calories. If we think about doing the opposite, if we want to lose a kilo of body fat, we need a 7,700 calorie deficit in place. No one's doing that in 1 day because it actually wouldn't even be true. Most people are let's say your maintenance is around 2,000. If you're eating at 1,700, you've got a 300 calorie deficit in place. A kilo is worth 7,700 calories. So it makes scientifically factual sense that it takes a while to get that movement happening. So if you're a person who thinks I've eaten good for 3 days or 8 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is, you've actually got to be able to settle into that for a little bit longer, a little bit more adherence and consistency before things actually start to get moving for that reason. Because like I said, we can't put a 7,700 calorie deficit in place in 1 day or 1 week or whatever, because we'd actually have to eat fuck all and probably just run laps of the block to burn enough energy. And it just wouldn't be feasible. We wouldn't be able to do it. So I think it's so common for people to think I've been in my fat loss phase for 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever. I should have lost a kilo. And it's funny, that's a bit of a side note, but I think I say this to the girls in the fat loss phase. It's a cool thing to just clock with yourself. What have you deemed as a, quote, good week of weight loss or progress, if that's your goal? If you're someone who's working towards a fat loss goal, usually without even really giving it much thought or knowing, most people have this thing in their mind where they're like, oh, I should lose half a kilo a week or 1 kilo a week or whatever. And again, you've probably never actually thought about it consciously and put those numbers into your mind. But most people then are weighing themselves and watching it and deeming things either good or bad for the week. Why have you deemed one thing good and one thing bad? What actual reason, education, resources, whatever, what is the reasoning behind that decision that you've made that this rate of loss would be good, this rate of loss would be bad. Because usually for people, there's no actual tangible reasoning behind it. We've just kind of settled in like a kilo a week or half a kilo a week or whatever it is. But it doesn't make a lot of sense when we then bring it back to the science and the facts and the numbers of how weight loss is achieved and how much of a deficit we have in place and everything. We obviously need to actually think about that stuff instead of just having that like, oh, I want to lose a kilo a week. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So coming back to my point, for myself, usually it takes those 3 or 4 weeks to even get things moving. And if we think about that, there's so much going on there, but I have given my body a fuck ton of energy for the last few months. So there's plenty there. There's plenty in excess. My body's good. So the day that I go into the deficit, my body's not suddenly just like, oh my God, pull it all out of storage. There's plenty of energy available for my body because I've given it heaps. So it's going to take a while to actually find itself in a deficit and be like, okay, fuck, there's not much coming in. We need to start really pulling from storage now. And if we think about what we've spoken about on the podcast before, if you don't understand that, go back and binge the whole pod. But literally the way we achieve fat loss is through not giving the body enough energy. It pulls excess energy out of storage, which stored energy is body fat. That is actually how fat loss is achieved. So if we think about everything I just said, I'm in that position where there's plenty of energy available in my body because I've given it heaps in the last few months. It's not just like, oh, day one, there's fuck all here, start pulling from stored body fat. So it's going to take a while to, like I said, settle into a deficit, realize that, okay, there's not a lot of energy floating around and available for me anymore. I actually have to start pulling from storage. And let that be okay. I reckon people would hear that like 3 to 4 weeks of perfect adherence and consistency and no movement on the scale and think that that is like the end of the world and they're such a victim and they're so hard done by, where really, I mean, there's so many things I could say about that. But first of all, like I said, really think about why you actually have that belief in the first place, because usually there's not a lot of facts, like factual shit to back it up. But secondly, one thing I love to point out, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before, maybe, but I love the quote of, if you've walked 6 miles into the woods, you have to walk 6 miles to get out. And I think it's so funny when people have navigated their nutrition in some way for a long time, and then whether that's, trying but falling off track or just not giving a fuck at all or having an intentional gaining phase, this can look like anything. But if you've had excess energy coming in, whether intentionally or not, but if you've been eating enough, given your body plenty of food for a while, we can't then expect to just turn it around after 4 days and be like, well, now I'm being good and I'm ticking boxes and I'm consistent, so where's my result, please? Like, we've got to be willing to actually look at, how long did I do things one way? I've now come out the other side. I'm doing it another way. It's going to take a similar amount of time to get things moving. And essentially, I don't want to say undo what I just did, but really if we want to think about it in that way, it is. If for me personally, I've spent 6 months putting on 6 kilos, why do I think I should deserve to get that off in 3 or 4 weeks? It doesn't make sense. So a cool thing to think about, and if you're someone who thinks you're a victim to slow progress, just know that me personally, that first month is always really slow. And the next thing that I want to speak to there is what I do when that happens is absolutely fucking nothing. As in, I keep doing exactly what I've been doing. I don't change the plan. I don't change the calories. And I speak about this in the fat loss phase. We do an intentional call about assessing and adjusting, and at what point do we actually assess and then put an adjustment in place if we think we need to. We can't do that in the second week of a fat loss phase. You can't spend, like I said, 9 days or 11 days eating a certain way and then being like, quote, this doesn't work for me, time to change the plan. It's simply not enough time if we think about everything I just said. You walk 6 miles into the woods. You don't walk fucking half a mile out and then go, nah, how come I'm not all the way out right now? Like, you've got to give it a bit more time. You've got to keep going. And if we think about that scenario of the woods, what is the option? You literally keep going. You're not going to turn around and walk back in. You're not going to fucking stand still. Your only option is to keep going. And this is what I love to point out to people is, if you're in a position where it has been 1 week or 2 weeks and you're starting to assess progress and you're like, things aren't working or whatever, the absolute best thing you can do is keep going and ticking boxes, because when you do get to a point where it actually makes sense to make an assessment and possibly an adjustment, which in my opinion is around that 3 or 4 week mark, you want to be able to look back and say, okay, this is exactly what I've done and this is the result that I got. And if we think about that, if you have pivoted and changed the plan on day 4 and then day 8 and day 11 because, quote, things weren't working, you can't then look back over a 3 or 4 week period and say, this is what I've done, because you fucking changed the plan 3 times in that 3 weeks. So you can't look at one intake and go, I ate this calorie intake and I got this result because of it. Because if you've changed that intake 3 times, you don't have enough adherence and consistency to one intake to actually be able to assess it. So super important to think about that. And this is where, like I said before, the emotion can kick in. If people are a few days in and they think things aren't working, they get very emotional and very frantic and like, I'm going to change everything. They do change things. If you change things too early, you're essentially back on day 1. And then you go again. And then you freak out after a few days and then you change it again. You're never getting to a point where you're 3 to 4 weeks in and being able to say, okay, cool, I've now actually got a good chunk of adherence and consistency to say whether something did or didn't work for me. And one little thing that came into my mind there, if we think about somebody actually doing a month, let's say, of really ticking boxes, being super consistent and having the data and the facts and everything to look at and say, okay, cool, this is what I did. This is where I'm at. I'm now assessing and potentially adjusting. When we look at that assessment, this is where it comes back to everything I was saying before. We want to have multiple methods and we want to assess the overall trend. I've said this so many times before, but we're never looking at like, what did I weigh Monday and then what did I weigh Wednesday? We're looking at the overall trend over time because, again, we know there's going to be fluctuations and ups and downs. But if we think about a person, let's just say, I'll use myself as an example. Let's say I start my fat loss phase day 1, I'm 68 kilos. I then maybe trend down through the 67s, spikes back up to 68 one day just because of fluctuations, back down to 67s, keep going into week 2, maybe we see the 67s again. And again, side note, this doesn't even usually happen for me. Usually it sits at fucking 68 for 4 weeks before this starts happening. But let's just say in this example, if you're then like trending down through the 67s and then maybe you see like a high 66 and then it comes back into the 67s and then it goes down through the 66s again. Maybe you start to even see a high 65. It spikes back up after time of the month or something. It comes back down. If we think about that throughout the 4 weeks, we've had days where like maybe we had a low weight and then the next day it went up. So there's a clear fluctuation. This is where a person can very emotionally be like, oh my God, it's not working. Really, it's literally just a 1-day fluctuation. If we step back over the 4 weeks, like I just said, we started at 68, we've come down into the 65s. Very, very clear overall trend in the direction that you want to go. But if you don't do this intelligently and actually assess that over time, and you do assess it overnight, as in I weighed this one day, I weighed this the next day, and then we're trying to like assess and adjust and make plans based off of that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So if we can step back and have that data over a period of time and make the assessment of the overall trend, and then we can look at multiple methods, as in measurements. Measurements might do the same thing. You might start with a belly button measurement of 70, and then, you know, in the second week it comes down to the 69s, and then in the next week we see a 68, and then maybe at 67 by the 4 week mark. Again, if you can look like, okay, cool, maybe shit did fluctuate from day to day or whatever, but my weight overall, like over the month, has come down 2 or 3 kilos. My stomach measurement has come down 3 centimeters. That's very clear evidence that things are moving. But if you just looked at these things as a one-off here and there, we wouldn't be able to assess that overall trend and therefore actually assess it intelligently. And the same sort of thing can happen. I said this in the scale weight episode, but I'm going to say it here. The same thing can happen when people just take weight once a week. I'm not a fan of the once a week weigh-in because, again, let's say you took it and it was 68, we'll use my example, and then if it was trending down, but then you just took it again on a random high fluctuation day, you wouldn't know that that was a random high fluctuation day. So then again, people can be like, oh my God, it hasn't moved, where it's like maybe it actually has moved. And then you've just jumped on when it's fluctuated by chance. It's kept moving again after that. But again, you're only weighing once a week, so you don't see that. What if you happen to jump on a fluctuation day again? And then we can start to, again, make these really emotionally charged like decisions and accusations, shit's not working, whatever, when really it's just that we don't have the intelligent assessment method in place. So my answer to that and my advice for that is to assess multiple methods, pics, measurements, weight, and assess the overall trend in weight. In my opinion, taking weight 4 to 7 times a week and watching the overall trend and watching the weekly average. And side note, if you're someone who really, really doesn't like taking one of these things, you definitely don't have to. Like, we don't have to weigh ourselves. We don't have to take measurements. We don't have to do any of these things. But I always say to people, if you have a goal and you're going to be watching progress towards that goal and questioning progress towards that goal, and if you're an Eat Like Ruby, questioning me because of your progress towards that goal, you want to make sure you've got the assessment method in place to actually see if you're moving towards it. The last thing we want to do, and I see this all the time, and this comes back to people hearing what they want to hear, because people will hear this and ignore it and then come at me with this shit. And what I'm talking about is people that are like, I don't like taking pics, so I'm not going to do that. Couldn't be fucked taking measurements, so I didn't do that. Weighed myself once a week. And then they get 3 weeks in and then they go, Rubes, nothing's working. What do you suggest? And then I'm like, okay, cool. Do you have any measurements for me? No. Do you have any pics for me? No. How often do you take weight? I've taken it 3 times in 24 days. There is nothing here to work with. We cannot actually make an assessment. And if we think about nutrition and training, and especially if we think about joining a program or having a coach, the role of the program and the coach, i.e. the role of me, is to come in with a very educated, factual mind, especially when the client or the person on the other end is having an emotional time. If you're having a bit of an emotional, like it's not working, I'm not going to meet emotion with emotion. If I came in and was like, oh my God, babe, it's not working, you poor thing, we're not going to fucking get anywhere. So it's my job to come in and go, okay, cool, let's look at the facts. Let's actually look at what's going on. And then I can give you tangible advice on what is happening here and how we proceed forward. If I go to do that and you say, I don't have pics, measurements, and I hardly ever take weight, but I'm having my big emotional spiral over here, what can I do to actually come in with the facts and the education and set a plan moving forward? So the reason I'm saying that, and even if you're not in Eat Like Ruby, if you're in any program, you want to think about that. If you're doing this for yourself, you want to think about that, because if your emotion kicks in, you want to be able to be like, okay, cool, emotion's doing its thing over here. Where's my facts and everything else over here that I can actually come back to? So the reason I'm saying that, like I said, is if you're sitting there thinking, no, I don't like pics, or I don't like weight, or I don't like anything like that, totally fine to leave something out if it really, really doesn't feel good for you. But really think about, okay, cool, well, if I'm going to assess my progress towards this thing at some point, I need to actually make sure I've got the shit in place to make that assessment. So just have a little think about that. And the other little thing I'll say there is people so often will say, I don't want to take pics. Guys, the amount of people that don't want to take pics when they're getting started and then get 4 weeks in, 6 weeks in, 6 months in, and are like, fuck, I wish I took pics, is so insane. I'd say that's like the number one thing that I hear, is the regret that we didn't take starting pics. So if you're someone who doesn't want to take those, I would just think about that, because you don't have to show them to anyone. You can keep them to yourself, but they're very cool. In this situation, they're very cool to look back on when we want to make an assessment, but they're also fucking cool to look back on. If you get 6 months into your journey and you've made wicked progress, you want to see that. And that's where the biggest regret comes in, where people are like, fuck, I wish I took them, but I didn't want to at the time. And the other thing about pics is, if we think about what I said before, where the goal isn't really to lose weight, the goal is to look or feel a certain way, the pics are going to show that more than anything. And for my own fat loss phase, pics and videos are the number one. Like, I will watch weight, I will watch measurements, but really to me, I don't have a goal weight. Like, I don't know where exactly I'm going to be on the scale when I decide to shift from fat loss to maintenance. It's purely going to be, how am I looking? How am I feeling? Am I where I want to be in that sense? And then I'll make the shift. Because again, to me, it's not about weighing a certain number. It's about looking and feeling a certain way. Pics and actually being myself and looking in the mirror and like asking how I'm feeling every day is the way I'm going to assess that. So just something to think about there as well. The goal isn't to weigh a certain number. The scale is part of the assessment method that we use to progress towards the ultimate goal, which is looking and feeling that certain way. The scale isn't the goal. So really, really have a think about that and get clear on that, guys. And that's why I think taking pics is so beneficial. And the last little thing I'll say on this, guys, I'm going to wrap it up, but I said this a few weeks ago when it came to getting started with nutrition and working towards a fat loss goal. The same thing applies here with progress, scale, pics, all of these things I'm speaking about. We can't expect that we're just going to have endless perfect days with these things. It's literally scientifically part of being a human being that you're going to have scale fluctuations, but it's also just very normal to have a bad day of looking in the mirror, have a bad day of photos, not like the video today, have a bloated day or something like that where the measurements don't move the way you want. This is just so insanely important to think about, because I said this with, like I said in that episode a few weeks back with nutrition. If you think about, think about the fat loss phase being a 10-week program that we do in Eat Like Ruby, you can't expect to just have 70 perfect days. If we think about 10 weeks, 70 days, just going to have everything work out in your favor. Everything's great. Happy days. Scale literally just trended down beautifully for 70 days in a row. Pics look better and better and better every time. It's so normal, common, expected, part of life, part of being a female, that you're probably going to have those weeks where you're just like, I fucking hate the scale today, I fucking hate the pics today, or whatever. And again, this is where having an outside person that's educated and not emotional when it comes to these things is so beneficial. But it's also just being okay with yourself and being like, can it be okay that I'm just having a bad day with this thing? I don't have to change my whole plan. When we think about assessing and adjusting, and like I said, I teach this in Eat Like Ruby, but we do this because of facts, evidence, data. We don't do this because of emotion. How am I feeling? I want to change everything. So be okay with sitting in those days and just being like, it's a bad day. That's it. It doesn't have to mean any more. Don't make it mean more. If you have a day where you don't like the way any of these things move, just be like, it's just a bad day. Don't make it mean more. Don't overthink it. Don't think you have to change the whole plan. Don't deem things not working. Think about everything I've just spoken about over time, not overnight, overall trends. Do it all intelligently. All of these things. It's not intelligent to wake up, have a bad day, and then spiral. So really have a think about that. Obviously, like I've said a few times, we cover this so much in the fat loss phase because it's such a big part of achieving a fat loss goal. Obviously, if we think about tracking progress, it's one of the main things. So we literally do this call in week 4, the beginning of week 4. So we've nailed 3 weeks, and then we come into week 4 and we start talking about assessing and adjusting for all the reasons I just said. I'm not going to do that call on fucking day 4 because people have literally been doing something for 72 hours. We can't assess it and we wouldn't adjust it. So we do this at a very intentional time for this reason. Obviously, like I said at the start, there's a lot of mindset, there's a lot of history and all the things that can come with this, and we do talk about that. But I'm also going to provoke you a little bit and call you forward a little bit to say, at what point do we detach from the way we've always done things? Do we detach from the story and say, okay, cool, this story was the way it was. I'm going to change it to make it different moving forward. And really just have a think about that. If you've got your stories and your conditioning and all of these thoughts and beliefs and everything with the scale or progress or pics or anything at all, are they serving you? Are you happy with them? Do you want to keep fucking clinging to them? Or at what point do we say, okay, cool, time to actually up level and move forward and navigate this in a different way? I think that is the perfect place to wrap up. I'm going to be back next week with another solo episode. Like I said, our last 4 episodes I think were really juicy, really beneficial. So go back and have a listen to those. If you haven't listened to the scale weight episode, just go back and search for it. I feel like it's in the 40s. Like the episodes all have numbers. So if you just keep like scrolling backwards, look around the 40s. It's literally called scale weight. If there was anything that we spoke about today that you think you want to kind of learn more about, we probably talked about it in that episode. Like always, all the episodes kind of tie in and flow in together. She's always rambling about the same stuff, but I hope you guys gained something from that episode today. Like I said, I'll be back next week with a solo ep. And once I get a few weeks into my fat loss phase, I'll obviously update you guys about that. But like I said, usually there's no updates for the first 4 weeks. So yay me. But on that note, guys, we are documenting my own personal fat loss phase on YouTube with weekly updates. So that's really cool if you want to watch what my physique looks like, how my progress goes, what my days of eating look like, etc. YouTube's a really cool place to do it. We're just doing like 10-minute-ish videos every week to update and follow along with the process. Obviously, I talk about this stuff on Instagram all day, every day. So if you're not following on Instagram and YouTube are both just Eat Like Ruby, very simple. And if you're keen to join the next Eat Like Ruby fat loss phase, that is literally opening up in about 6 days, Wednesday, the 17th of July. We are opening up our final fat loss phase for the year. So save the date, mark your calendar, set your reminders, get your shit together, get in that one. It is going to be the final round, big round. Get ready for summer, get after it. Let's actually go. That is all from me today, guys. I will be back next week.